She hadn't fallen behind. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been sent ahead on purpose, given a task that didn't need doing, so that by the time she returned to the clearing, the tracks would already be filling with snow and there would be nothing left to call out to. 22 years old, a bad hip, a storm closing in from the northwest, and the slow, gutting realization that the people who were supposed to be hers had looked at her and made a calculation. She didn't survive it. She just hadn't died yet. If you've ever felt like dead weight to the people who should have carried you, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Cascades in late November did not care what your name was. That was the first thing Evelyn Hart had learned when they crossed into the mountain range 4 days ago. That the wind coming down off those peaks carried no opinions about who deserved warmth and who didn't, about who had earned their place in the wagon and who was merely tolerated in it. The cold was indifferent. It pressed against skin and wool and cracked leather with the same patient, grinding pressure, whether you were 18-year-old Caleb with broad shoulders and an easy laugh, or whether you were Evelyn with her bad left hip and her extra weight, and the way her breath always came a little harder than everyone else's on the uphill grades. Indifferent was almost better than what she got inside that wagon. She had been awake before anyone that morning. 4th day into the pass, the sky still the color of old iron, because sleeping in the wagon bed meant sleeping between Caleb's restless kicking and the hard wooden ribs of the frame. And at some point around 3 in the morning, her hip had started its familiar, low complaint, the deep grinding ache that lived in the joint and woke up whenever the temperature dropped below a certain point. She had eased herself upright without waking anyone, climbed out the back without letting the canvas flap, stood in the pre-dawn cold and breathed. The mountains were something, she'd give them that. She couldn't look at them without feeling something tighten in her chest. Not admiration exactly, more like the feeling you get looking at something that would kill you without noticing. The peaks caught whatever dim early light existed and threw it back in pale grays and sharp whites. The tree line was thick and black below the snowfields, and above, everything was just rock and ice and sky. The pass cut through all of it like an old scar, and the wagon road, such as it was, wound along the floor of that scar, following a frozen creek bed that their guide had assured them would be passable until December at the earliest. Their guide, Evelyn reflected, had turned back 2 days ago when the weather started looking uncooperative, which she took to mean dangerous. Her stepmother had called him a coward. Her father had paid him his remaining fee anyway, because that was how her father was. Conflict-averse in the particular way of men who had spent years learning to keep the peace in their own household, which meant he had also learned to keep the peace at the cost of everything else. Evelyn had watched the guide go and felt something she didn't have a good word for. Not fear. Fear was too clean. More like the awareness of a door closing behind you that you didn't realize was the last door. Her name was Margaret, Evelyn's stepmother. Margaret Elise Hart, née Caulfield, who had married Evelyn's father 3 years after her mother's death, when Evelyn was 14, and who had, from the first week, established a clear and efficient taxonomy of people in the household. There were useful people, and there were burdens. The distinction was not moral, Margaret had explained once to Evelyn, with the flat, reasonable tone she used for most things. It was practical. In a harsh world, you had to know what things cost. Evelyn had been 14 and still raw from her mother's death, and had not understood yet what was being said to her. She understood it better now. The hip injury had come at 16, a fall from the barn loft, bad landing, badly set by a doctor who charged less than he was worth. It had healed wrong. It would always hurt in cold weather. It slowed her on rough terrain, and in the year after it happened, when she'd had to spend 3 months largely confined to the farmhouse while the work continued without her, Margaret had conducted a quiet, efficient accounting of what Evelyn contributed versus what she cost, and had arrived at a figure that she never stated directly but communicated constantly. You could hear it in the way she assigned tasks. You could hear it in the silences at dinner when Evelyn was slow to stand and clear the plates. You could hear it in the conversations she had with Evelyn's father that stopped when Evelyn walked into a room. Her father was a good man in the ways that don't ultimately protect anyone. He loved Evelyn. She believed that. He just loved peace more. And peace, in their household, meant not contradicting Margaret. So when Margaret had decided that the family was pulling up its roots in Oregon and heading east to Montana, where her brother had land and prospects, Evelyn had been included in the plan the way a piece of furniture gets included in a move. Not because it's wanted in the new place, but because getting rid of it before the move takes more effort than just bringing it along. The morning the trouble started, they had been making slow progress along the pass road for about 2 hours when the weather changed. Not gradually. The Cascades didn't do gradual. It was gray and cold and still one moment, and then the wind picked up from the northwest, and there was snow in it. Not flurries, not a dusting, but the heavy, intent kind that meant the mountain had made a decision. The horses felt it. The 2 draft animals her father kept, a gray roan named Chester and a dull black gelding they'd bought in Portland and never bothered naming, both went stiff and uncertain, and her father had to work the reins with both hands to keep them on the road. Margaret sat in the front of the wagon with her back straight, and her face composed in the expression she wore when she had already decided how things were going to go. Evelyn sat in the back with Caleb, who was 17 and had his mother's manner of conducting himself as though inconveniences were other people's problems. He had his rifle across his knees and was cleaning it with a rag, not because it needed cleaning, but because it gave him something to look purposeful about. "Storm's coming in," Evelyn said, not to anyone specifically. "Thank you, Evelyn," Margaret said from the front. The tone said, "Obviously," and also, "No one asked you." Her father didn't say anything. He was focused on the horses. They pushed on for another hour. The snow came harder. The wagon was working more for less distance now, the wheels catching on ice-slicked rock beneath the accumulating snow, the horses blowing out great steaming breaths with each pull. The road, such as it was, had started to disappear into uniform white. You could still make out the creek bed to the left and the rock face to the right, but the ground between them was becoming a guess. Then Margaret spoke, in the particular clear voice she used for decisions. "We need firewood. There's a stand of timber about a quarter-mile east, back off the road to the south. Evelyn," she half-turned in the seat, "you'll go ahead and collect what you can. We'll bring the wagon up behind you." Evelyn looked at her. I can see the storm, Evelyn." Still that flat, reasonable tone. "Which is why we need to collect wood before we lose the stand in the snow. You can walk faster than the horses can pull in these conditions. Go ahead, find the timber, gather what you can carry. We'll follow." Her father was still working the horses. He didn't turn around. Caleb was still cleaning his rifle. Evelyn sat for a moment and she felt something. A recognition, maybe. The same door feeling she'd had when the guide turned back. But she couldn't name it into language yet. She couldn't build it into an argument. And in their household, if you couldn't produce a clean argument, you deferred. She climbed out of the wagon. "Take the rope," Margaret said, handing back a coil of it. "For bundling." Evelyn took the rope. She pulled her coat tighter. A heavy wool thing that had been her mother's, let out at the seams and still never quite right across her shoulders. And she went east along the road, head down against the wind. She didn't look back. She should have. She didn't. The stand of timber was there. That much was true. She spent about 20 minutes in it, working around the base of the trees for deadfall, anything dry enough to burn. Her hip was already complaining in the cold, and the snow was deep enough between the trees that each step required lifting her whole leg rather than just stepping, which meant that by the time she'd gathered a workable armload, she was breathing hard, and her hip was past complaining and into the steady, white-hot throb she associated with pushing too far too fast. She bundled what she had with the rope. A good armload, tight. She'd done this before. She knew what she was doing. Then she picked it up and turned back toward the road. The snow had changed while she was in the timber. What had been heavy flurries 20 minutes ago was now something more serious. A true mountain snowfall, thick and fast and wind-driven, cutting visibility down to about 30 feet. She could still see the road. She could see where she'd walked, the tracks already filling but not gone. She followed them back to the clearing. The clearing was empty. She stood at the edge of it for a long moment with the firewood bundle in her arms, and her mind did the thing minds do when they encounter something that doesn't fit, ran through the other explanations first. They'd moved a little further east. They'd pulled off somewhere to wait out the worst of the wind. Her father had found a better spot. There was a logical reason. There was always a logical reason. She went east on the road, scanning. The snow was covering the wagon tracks, but not completely, not yet. She could still see the depressions, the particular pattern of wagon wheels and horse hooves moving east. Not stopped, not pulled aside. Moving, continuing, past the stand of timber, past where she'd been sent, past where she'd expected them to be. The tracks just kept going east. She stood in the road and watched the snow fill them in. The firewood bundle was heavy. Her arms had started shaking, from cold or from something else she wasn't ready to name yet. She set it down in the snow and just stood there, breathing, watching the tracks disappear. It took probably another 5 minutes for the fact to complete itself in her mind. Not an accident, not a detour, not a miscommunication. They hadn't lost her. They had put her down like something too heavy to keep carrying, and they had walked away. She didn't cry. She noted this about herself later when she had time to think about it, that her first response was not grief, but something colder and more functional. A kind of very fast, very quiet inventory. What she had: the wool coat, worn leather boots, good soles, wool skirt and underlayers, not enough. The rope from the firewood bundle, a small folding knife she kept in her coat pocket, not much more than a tool, really, 3-inch blade. Flint and steel in the same pocket. She'd taken to carrying them herself after a trip the previous spring when the family's fire kit got waterlogged. No food, no water vessel beyond the tin cup she'd been drinking from at breakfast that was back in the wagon. No bedroll. What she faced: a full mountain snowstorm, building, an injury that was already active. The east end of the pass, probably another 6 or 7 miles if she was right about where they were. The temperature dropping with every hour toward evening. What she had on her side, the fact that she was still standing. She picked up the firewood. She went east. There are types of suffering that are sharp, sudden, spiking, demanding, and there are types that are slow and comprehensive, that don't announce themselves as crisis so much as settle over everything like weather. Walking in deep snow in a mountain storm on a bad hip was both, depending on the moment. The first mile was just work. Uncomfortable, cold, the hip complaining steadily, her breath coming in clouds, and her vision limited to a gray-white tunnel of moving snow. But work was work. She'd done worse, physically, on the farm. She could handle work. The second mile was where the hip moved from complaint to protest. Not sharp pain, not yet. More like the joint was slowly seizing, losing range, getting stiffer with each step, requiring more effort for the same movement. She'd learned the pattern well enough. It would get worse before it stabilized, and if she pushed too hard before it stabilized, she risked the genuine crippling spike that would put her on the ground. So she slowed. She set her weight more carefully. She used the firewood bundle as a kind of counterbalance on the inclines, which were becoming more frequent and more severe as the pass narrowed. She talked to herself. She did this sometimes when things were bad, not out loud, just a running internal voice that was sometimes her own and sometimes her mother's, low and practical and stripped of sentiment. Left foot, right foot. The road goes east, you go east, that's all. The problem was the snow. Mountain snow in a pass storm doesn't fall in a polite, manageable way. It comes horizontal when the wind builds. It fills in the depressions that tell you where the road is and where the drop-off is, and suddenly everything is the same white surface with the same white depth, and you're navigating by memory and by instinct, and by the fact that the ground to your left sounds different when you tap it with your heel, less solid, more like ice over nothing. And so you go right, you keep going right, you hug the rock face and use it as your guide. She dropped the firewood somewhere in the 3rd mile. Not dropped, set down. She told herself she was setting it down, that she would come back for it. She knew, even as she told herself this, that it wasn't true. It was too heavy. She was too slow. She needed both arms for balance on the terrain she was hitting now, which had stopped being anything like a managed road and had become a series of iced-over rock outcroppings she had to pick her way between. The hip, by this point, had gone from protest to the white-hot throb. Real pain, the kind that demanded attention in a way that made it hard to think clearly about anything else. Left foot, right foot. She thought about Margaret's face, the way she'd handed back the rope. Take the rope. For bundling. Not cruel in her expression. That was the thing Evelyn kept coming back to. Not triumphant or vicious or even particularly calculated looking. Just the same composed, flat efficiency Margaret brought to all her decisions. A cost-benefit determination. Evelyn cost more than she contributed. In a difficult crossing, in a harsh land, that was a problem with an obvious solution. She thought about her father. She thought about whether he'd known, and then she stopped thinking about that because it was the kind of thought that could hollow you out from the inside if you let it run too long. Left foot, right foot. The wind was coming from the wrong direction now. She'd been using it to orient herself. Northwest, which meant east was to her right, but it had shifted, or she had drifted, and suddenly she wasn't sure. The rock face she'd been following had broken into a series of boulders that gave her too many options, and none of them looked like a road. She stopped. Standing still in a blizzard is a different kind of cold than moving. When you're moving, the cold is friction. It resists you, you resist it, and there's a transaction happening that at least keeps the blood in your hands. When you stop, the cold becomes a presence. It settles in. It finds the thin places in your clothing, the places where the wool has worn or the coat doesn't quite close at the throat, and it sets up residence there with the patient confidence of something that knows it will win eventually. She was shaking, full body now, not just her arms. She recognized this. It wasn't weakness, it was the body doing its job. Shivering was heat generation. It was the organism fighting back. But it was also information. Information that said, you don't have much time. She looked around. To her left, about 10 feet off, a hollow between two large boulders. Not a cave, just a notch in the rock, maybe 4 feet deep, enough to break the direct wind. She moved to it, more stumbling than walking now, and got herself into it and got her back against the cold stone and pulled her coat tight and put her arms inside it as far as she could manage and sat down. The wind noise was slightly less inside the hollow. Slightly. She needed fire. She had flint and steel and no dry tinder because the tinder she'd been carrying was in the firewood bundle 2 miles back. She tried anyway. She had a few fibers of wool she pulled from the inside of her coat hem, a scrap of paper from her pocket, a folded letter, old, from a cousin who'd moved to California, crinkled and damp with sweat and cold, the steel and flint. And she worked the strike pattern until her fingers were too numb to coordinate it, and the sparks flew but caught nothing, and she gave up on fire. She pulled her knees to her chest as far as her hip would allow. The snow was building up at the entrance to the hollow. Not enough to seal it, but the light was already going, afternoon dimming toward evening, and with it went the last clear definition between rock and snow and air. Everything was going gray and quiet and white. She thought, this is how it ends. Not in the way of someone giving up, more like the flat, information processing way she'd been thinking all day. This was the data. A 22-year-old woman with a compromised hip, no food, inadequate gear, in a mountain storm in November, sitting in a hollow in a rock field with numb hands and a core temperature that was going the wrong direction. Run the numbers. They weren't good numbers. She thought about what it would feel like to stop shaking. She'd heard that was how it went, that at some point the body stopped fighting and it felt like warmth, which was the cruelest thing about hypothermia, she thought, that the end of it felt like relief. Her eyes were getting heavy. She closed them for a moment. The sound was all wrong. Something crunching through the snow. Not the soft, irregular fall of snow clumping off trees, but the deliberate rhythmic crunching of something heavy moving through deep pack with purpose. She heard it first as something just outside her dream, or whatever had started in the space between consciousness and the other thing, and it pulled her back. She opened her eyes. The light was nearly gone. How long had she been sitting here? An hour? Less? The crunching was getting closer. Something in her responded to it before her mind caught up, her body flinching back into the shallow hollow, the animal instinct that said unknown large thing in proximity before the human part processed that might be a person. Wolves made noise like this in snow. Bears, if they hadn't denned yet. Men made noise like this too, and men in a mountain pass in a blizzard were not necessarily a safer prospect than wolves. She tried to speak. What came out was not a word. Her mouth had lost coordination, but something between a sound and a cough, and she tried again and got something louder. Here. A word, barely. Here. In the rocks. The crunching paused, then, I hear you, keep talking. A man's voice, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned to stay level because panic in wilderness was a luxury that cost too much. In the hollow, she managed. Between two, she coughed. Big boulders, left of the creek. I see it, the voice said. I'm coming. She heard the footsteps change direction and come toward her, and then there was a shape blocking the entrance to the hollow. Tall, wide-shouldered, massive in heavy furs that made him look like part of the mountain he was standing in front of. And then he crouched down and his face was inside the hollow, and she could see it for the first time, or as much as the failing light allowed. A hard face. Not cruel, but hard. The face of someone who spent most of his time in a place that required hardness. Heavy dark brow, a jaw that had something like a few weeks of beard on it, eyes that caught the last gray light and held it steady. He was looking at her the way she'd seen people look at a problem they were calculating. Not with pity. Pity was worse than nothing in her experience, just assessment. How long have you been here? I don't know. I lost track. Can you stand? I'm not sure. He didn't tell her to try. He reached into the hollow, got an arm under hers, and stood up, and she came up with him. Not gracefully, her hips screaming a complaint that made her breath catch in her throat. And she was on her feet, or at least near enough to on her feet that she wasn't falling, and he had his arms solid under hers, taking a significant portion of what she weighed. Cabin's a mile, he said. Can you walk a mile? I don't know, she said again. She was through lying about what she knew and didn't know. There didn't seem to be much point in it. All right, he said, as if that was an acceptable answer. Then we'll find out. The mile was not a mile any normal person would recognize. It was ice and boulder and wrong-angled slopes in near darkness in a snowstorm. And she didn't know how he navigated it except that he clearly knew this terrain the way she knew the farm. Not by map, but by body. By some accumulated memory of every feature and landmark that lived somewhere below conscious thought. He moved with the slow certainty of someone for whom this mountain in this darkness was not an emergency, but a Tuesday. He didn't let go of her. She didn't thank him for this. There was a point. Somewhere around the third or fourth time her hips seized and he adjusted his hold without comment and waited for her to find her footing again, when she understood that thanking him would be the wrong register. This wasn't charity. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was the same flat pragmatism she'd been operating from all day. She was a person in the snow who would die in the snow without assistance. He was a person who could provide assistance, therefore assistance was provided. The transaction was clean. She could work with that. The cabin appeared out of the darkness gradually. Not a shape so much as a texture, something that wasn't snow or rock, and then the smell of smoke, and then the low orange line of firelight under a door. And she hadn't realized until that moment how much that particular combination, smoke and firelight, meant to a human body near its limits. Something in her chest released, some clenched thing, and for the first time all day she was aware of being close to crying, not from grief or fear, but just from the plain animal relief of warmth existing somewhere ahead. He got the door open and they went inside. Warm. The word didn't cover it. After what her skin had been doing for the last several hours, spending every resource fighting to maintain temperature against a sustained assault, the heat from the fireplace came in like a physical thing, pressing against her face and hands and through her coat. And her body's first response was to shake even harder, which she knew was correct, which didn't make it less disorienting. She stood just inside the door and shook and tried to take in the space. A single room, large enough. Rough-hewn walls. A fireplace built from stone, substantial. The kind of fireplace you build when you intend to live in a place for a long time. Animal pelts on the walls. Not decoration, practical insulation and storage. A plank table, 2 chairs. A rope-strung bed in the corner with heavy blankets. Tools hung from the ceiling. Traps, rope, a rifle, axes. Things she didn't immediately have names for. Shelving with jars and leather pouches. The floor was packed dirt except near the fire where flat stones had been set. Everything in the room was for something. Nothing was extra. Sit by the fire, he said. He was already moving to a shelf, pulling things down. She went to the fire. She sat on the stones in front of it, which was not graceful. Lowering herself with the hip in its current state required a specific sequence of careful movements that looked, she knew, effortful and slow. And then she was sitting, and the fire was about 18 inches from her face, and she put her hands out toward it and felt the heat begin its slow work on her fingers. He set a tin pot on the iron hook over the fire. He had been doing something at the shelf. She heard liquid and then smelled it as the pot heated. Something with meat in it, fat and salt, and something else she couldn't identify. He pulled one of the chairs to the fire's edge and sat in it, not close, not far. He didn't speak for a while. She didn't either. The shaking was starting to ease. The fire was doing what fire does. "Ronan," he said, eventually. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "That's your name?" she asked. "Ronan Creed, yeah." "Evelyn Hart." He nodded, as if this was information he was filing away for later. Another silence. The pot was beginning to bubble softly. "Where were you headed?" he asked. She thought about how to answer this. The true answer was complicated. She settled for the last part of it. "East, through the pass. In November. We had a guide. He turned back." She paused. "2 days ago. You were with people?" "I was with my family." She looked at the fire. The heat was reaching her face now, the dead cold feeling in her cheeks starting to unlock into something that was almost pain. "They—" She stopped, tried again. "They went on without me." He was quiet for a long moment. "How far back?" he asked. The fire would stand. "Maybe 4 miles. Another silence. "Not an accident," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him. His face was still turned toward the fire, and in the firelight it was all angles. The jaw, the brow, the sharp ridge where the cheekbone caught the orange glow. He was not looking at her with pity. He was just stating a fact and waiting to see if she'd correct it. "No," she said. "Not an accident." He didn't say anything to that. He got up and used a cloth to take the pot off the hook and poured some of the contents into a tin cup and handed it to her. Broth, thick, some kind of rendered fat on top with bits of meat, and what might be dried greens. "Drink slow," he said. She drank slow. He sat back in his chair and was quiet, and she drank the broth and let the fire warm her through, and the cabin settled into the sounds of snow against the walls and the fire doing its low, continuous work. And outside, the storm was indifferent and enormous, and entirely unconcerned with the question of who had been abandoned and who had been found. And inside, for the first time all day, Evelyn Hart was warm. She was asleep before she knew she was tired. She came back to herself sometime deep in the night. The fire had banked down to coals, the cabin was darker, and she was on the rope bed under heavy blankets, which meant he'd moved her from the hearthstones at some point, and she had not woken for it, which told her more about her state than she wanted to know. She lay still for a while, taking account. Hip, bad. Not emergency bad. Not the acute spike, but settled into the deep ache that meant it would be stiff and limited for at least a day, probably 2. Core temperature felt normal. Hands and feet painful in the way that said blood returning to places it had abandoned, which meant no frostbite, or at least not serious frostbite. Alive. She turned that over. Alive. Here. In a cabin in the Cascades belonging to a man she didn't know named Ronan Creed on the other side of one of the longest days she could remember, with nothing. No family, no gear, no destination, no resources beyond what was in her coat pockets. She waited for the panic, the grief, the comprehensive wave of feeling that she assumed was going to arrive once the survival urgency cleared and her body and mind understood what had happened. She waited. What came instead was quieter, something that didn't have a name exactly, but felt, in an odd way, like the first honest breath after a very long time of breathing around something. Her family had made their choice about her value. They had run the numbers, the way Margaret ran all numbers, and they had come to a conclusion. And she had been right there in the snowstorm, in the hollow, nearly at the end of everything, and she had found out what she was worth when there was nothing left to prove to anyone. She had called out. She had told him where she was. She had walked the mile. Not gracefully, not without cost, but she had walked it. Outside the cabin, the storm went on. Snow on the roof, wind at the walls. The coals in the fireplace put out a steady breathing heat. Somewhere in the dark, Ronan Creed's breathing was slow and even. He'd taken the floor, she could hear him, some distance from the bed. Evelyn lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. And this was not insomnia. This was something else. This was the mind of a person who has just survived something, sitting quietly with the fact of its survival, not celebrating it, not dramatizing it, just holding it up to whatever light there was and looking at it carefully. She was alive. She was here. And tomorrow she would wake up with a bad hip and no belongings in a stranger's cabin in a mountain pass, and she would have to figure out what that meant. But she would wake up. That was not nothing. Outside, the storm pressed on. Inside, the coals held. And Evelyn Hart lay in the dark, unrescued and unlost, and breathed in the smoke and pine smell of the cabin and felt, underneath everything, the very slow and tentative beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. Not hope. Something harder than hope. Something that would need more than one night to name. The morning after a near-death experience is a strange, flat thing. Evelyn had expected something more dramatic from it. Some fundamental shift in how the light looked or how the air tasted. Some signal from the world that yesterday had mattered. What she got instead was a sore hip, a dry mouth, and the smell of something burning. She sat up in the rope bed and found Ronan standing at the fireplace with his back to her, doing something with a cast iron pan that was producing a smell somewhere between scorched fat and actual food. The coals had been built back up into a real fire. Gray morning light came through one small window, oilskin covered, not glass, which explained why it had been so dark even before the storm darkened everything further. The storm. She listened. Wind still present, but different, steadier, without the gust and drop pattern of yesterday's worst hours. Snow against the oilskin window. The mountain was still working, but less frantically. "Morning," she said. Her voice came out rough. He glanced over his shoulder. "You're awake." "Apparently." He turned back to the pan. "Can you sit at the table?" She tested the hip. It answered the way she'd expected. A deep, grinding complaint when she moved, better once she was actually standing, which was the perverse logic of the injury. The worst moment was always the transition from still to moving. She got herself upright and moved to the table with the careful, deliberate gait she'd developed over years of managing it. Not limping exactly, more like moving on purpose. She sat. He brought her the pan and divided what was in it between two tin plates. Some kind of cornmeal with pieces of dried meat mixed through it, overcooked on one side. He set a plate in front of her and took the other to his side of the table and sat. She ate. He ate. Neither of them spoke for a while, and this was not uncomfortable. Or at least, it wasn't the kind of uncomfortable that demanded to be filled. "How bad's the hip?" he asked, without looking up from his plate. She considered lying about this and decided not to. "Bad. Not the worst it's been, but bad. I'll need a day before I can put serious weight on it in rough terrain." He nodded, like this was information going into a column somewhere. "Storm won't clear for at least 2 days," he said. "Probably 3. She looked at her plate. 3 days. She didn't have a frame of reference for what 3 days in this cabin, with this man she didn't know, was going to look like. She didn't have a frame of reference for much of her current situation, honestly. She decided the only reasonable approach was to take it in smaller units. Today. Just today. "I want to be useful," she said. "Whatever needs doing. I don't want to just sit here." He looked at her then. A straight, assessing look. Not unkind, but not soft either. Like he was recalibrating something. "You just walked 4 miles through a blizzard on a bad hip," he said. "I know what I did. I'm not saying you can't be useful. I'm saying you don't have to prove anything today." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to not be what I've been called my whole life." He didn't respond to that. He went back to his plate. But something in his jaw shifted slightly. Not quite a reaction, more like a word he'd chosen to keep. She ate the rest of her meal in silence. The cabin, she learned over the course of that first full day, had its own logic. Ronan had built it 7 years ago, he told her, when he said anything at all, which was infrequently. He'd come out of Montana originally. She'd catch the vowels sometimes, flat and northern, and had worked trap lines in the Cascades for most of that time. He knew the range the way she'd known the farm, not as landscape, but as system, where the game ran, where the water sources were under the ice, which routes became impassable in certain storm directions, and which stayed viable almost regardless. He was not a talkative man, but he wasn't closed exactly. He answered direct questions directly, without decoration, and he didn't seem to have Margaret's particular talent for making silences say things that words wouldn't. His silences were just silences. She found she could exist inside them without feeling assessed. She spent the morning doing what she could do, sitting down. He had a pile of leather harness pieces that needed stitching, broken buckles, and split seams that he'd been accumulating. And she found the awl and thread on the shelf where he told her they'd be, and she worked through the pile steadily, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this kind of work before. Her mother had taught her to sew leather. Her mother had taught her a lot of practical things that Margaret had deemed unnecessary accomplishments for a girl of Evelyn's particular limitations. She stitched harness all morning and tried not to think about her father. Midday, Ronan came back inside from checking something outside. She'd heard him go out and come in twice, each time bringing a wave of cold air and snow. And he stopped when he saw what she'd done. She'd cleared about 2/3 of the pile. The finished pieces were stacked on the table, neatly. She'd done the stitching tight and even, doubled on the stress points. He picked up one of the finished pieces and looked at the seam. He didn't say anything. He set it back down. "You know leather work," he said. My mother taught me, before she died." She kept her hands moving. She believed in knowing how to fix things. He pulled his chair to the other side of the table and sat and picked up one of the remaining pieces and started working on it himself, in silence, beside her. They worked through the rest of the pile that way. Well, the conversation, if it could be called that, happened in pieces over those first days, never in one sustained exchange, more like a slow accumulation of facts traded across a common silence. She learned that he'd lost a brother to a river crossing the second year he was out here. He didn't offer much detail on this, just mentioned it in the context of talking about a particular trap line that crossed a creek he no longer used. She learned that he came into the nearest town, a 3-day ride in clear weather, about twice a year, traded his pelts, restocked, came back. He did not seem to miss the town. He did not seem to miss company. He learned in the same accumulated way that she'd been a farm girl in Oregon, that her mother had died of fever when she was 11, that she had a brother, Caleb, who was 17 and who she was working to feel no particular warmth for right now. He didn't ask about the father. She thought he understood, from what she'd said that first night, that the father was a complicated category. On the second afternoon, she asked him why he'd been out in the storm. He was checking his traps, he said. He ran a line in the near area even in bad weather. The trap line didn't stop because the weather got difficult, and the traps that caught something needed to be cleared before the catch froze solid, or something larger came along and helped itself to it. He'd been working the eastern edge of his near line when he heard her call out. "I almost didn't," she said. He looked at her. "Call out," she clarified. "I wasn't sure if you were... I couldn't tell what I was hearing, and I was..." She stopped. "I was pretty far gone. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things." "You weren't?" "No." She thought about the sound of those footsteps in the snow, the way they'd pulled her back from whatever had started at the edges. "You walked straight to me. I've been in this range for 7 years. I know where the rock hollows are. Still..." She turned a piece of cordage over in her hand, something she'd been working on rebraiding. "You didn't have to stop." He looked at her steadily. "What would have happened if I hadn't?" She met his eyes. They both knew the answer. "I know," she said. "I'm not saying obligation. I'm saying..." She struggled with the right word. "I'm saying thank you isn't enough, and I don't have anything else, so I'm using it anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "You're here," he said. "That's enough." 3 days became 4 as the storm refused to fully clear. The pass, Ronan told her, would be closed now. Not permanently, but closed enough that any wagon traffic was stopped. The question of whether to try to follow her family east was answered by weather before it needed to be answered by her, which she told herself was neither relief nor disappointment and mostly believed. Her hip improved. Not healed. It would never fully heal. That was the honest reality she'd made her peace with years ago. But the acute inflammation settled back into its usual background state, and she could move more freely, put real weight on it without the spike, navigate the cabin and even the short distance to the woodpile and back without needing to brace against anything. She started cooking. Not because he asked her to. He had his own basic system that was functional, if not particularly sophisticated, but because she was good at it, and because having something concrete to do with her time kept her from the longer, darker thinking that crept in whenever she sat idle. She found his stores, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, dried fruit, some root vegetables stored in a cold corner of the cabin, several jars of preserved things she identified by smell when she opened them. Wild onion, some kind of berry, something herb-like she couldn't place. There was flour in a sealed tin. There was rendered lard. She made actual food. Not just heated up to acceptable, but real food, the kind her mother had made on the farm, where you worked with what you had and treated the ingredients like they deserved some respect. Ronan came in at midday and stopped in the doorway and looked at the pot on the fire and then at her. "Bean soup," she said. "I used the salt pork. I hope that's all right." He came in, hung his coat, washed his hands in the basin. He sat at the table. She brought him a bowl. He ate about half of it before he looked up. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother, and then necessity." She sat across from him with her own bowl. "Margaret, my stepmother, she wasn't interested in the kitchen, so it became mine." "Lucky for her," he said. She looked at him. It took a half-second to realize he wasn't being sarcastic. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said about my cooking," she said. He went back to his bowl. "It's not that complicated a compliment." "No," she agreed. "But I'll take it." Bashem. On the fifth morning, he took her outside to show her the woodpile situation. This was not a social gesture. The storm had settled into intermittent heavy snowfall with brief clear windows, and they were burning wood at the rate that a real mountain winter required, which meant the woodpile needed attention. He showed her where the maul was, where the splitting blocks were, which logs were seasoned and which were still too green for good burning. "I'm not asking you to split wood," he said, "not with the hip, but knowing what we have is useful." "I can split wood," she said. He looked at her. "Slowly," she amended. "With the right technique. I've been doing it since I was 15. She paused. "My stepmother thought it was undignified for me to chop wood, so I did it when she wasn't watching." Something happened in his face. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. A brief shift that didn't become a smile, but acknowledged the existence of smiles as a category. "We can try it," he said. "Stop if the hip gives you trouble." She went through about a quarter of the remaining rounds, slowly, setting her weight carefully on each swing to minimize the torque on the bad joint. Her technique was not elegant. It was functional. She hit what she was aiming at most of the time, and what she missed, she hit on the second swing, and when the hip started telling her to stop, she stopped. Ronan had been stacking what she split without commentary. When she put the maul down, he looked at the stacked wood and then at her. "Good," he said. One word. She was learning that from Ronan, one word could be a full sentence. The first real crack appeared between them on the 6th day, and it was her fault, or at least she owned it. She had been going through the shelf, reorganizing, if she was honest with herself, because the ordering of things on it made no particular sense, and the cook in her was bothered by jars of preserved food being stored next to trap hardware. And she moved a tin to the lower shelf that turned out to have some kind of documentation in it, folded papers, and she'd had it in her hand for only a second when he said, from across the room sharply, "Don't." She set it down immediately. "I'm sorry. I was just reorganizing the shelf. Leave that shelf alone." The tone was different from anything she'd heard from him yet. Not angry, but closed. A door that had been open a small amount suddenly shut. She stepped back from the shelf. "I wasn't trying to go through your things," she said. "I'm sorry." He crossed the room and picked up the tin and put it back where it had been, and his movements were controlled in the way that said he was managing something beneath the surface. He stood with his back to her for a moment. "There are parts of this cabin that are mine," he said, finally. His voice was level again, back to its usual register. I don't mean to be. You don't have to explain," she said. "I do, actually." He turned around. His face was uncomfortable in a specific way she hadn't seen on him before. The discomfort of a man who had lived alone long enough that privacy had stopped being about courtesy and had become something closer to survival. "Those are my brother's letters that I didn't open before he died, and I've never—" He stopped. "I've never decided what to do with them." She stood very still. "I understand," she said. "I won't touch that shelf again." He nodded. He went back to what he'd been doing, and she went back to what she'd been doing, and the silence that settled between them afterward was different from the earlier silences. It had more weight, more texture, the weight of something that had been said that mattered, but it was not hostile. It was more like the silence after a door has been opened by accident and closed by consent, and both people in the room know where the door is now. She thought about her own things she hadn't decided what to do with. The letter in her pocket, her cousin's letter, damp and half ruined from the storm, still there because she hadn't thrown it away and wasn't sure why. The image of her father's hands on the reins, turned away. The sound of wagon wheels going east. There were things she hadn't opened yet, either. By the end of the first week, they had developed a rhythm. It was not a planned rhythm, not an agreed-upon one. It had assembled itself out of the practical logic of two people in a small space trying to be functional. She cooked. He trapped and brought in wood and water. She maintained the cabin while he worked outside. He handled anything that required moving in the deep snow for extended distances. She handled anything that could be done inside or in the near perimeter. None of this was discussed. It arrived. She watched him when he thought she wasn't watching. Not with any particular agenda, just the close observation she'd always done with people who interested her, which was a habit that had gotten her in trouble with Margaret more than once. Staring is rude, Evelyn. It's one of your less appealing qualities. He moved through the cabin with a kind of compressed efficiency, no wasted steps, everything done at the pace it needed to be done, and not faster. He didn't fidget. He didn't seem to have the running interior noise that she'd noticed in most people, the sense of someone constantly narrating their own situation to themselves. He was just present, in the room, in the task. She found it unusually calming in a way she wouldn't have predicted. She had grown up in a house where she was always being observed, always being measured, always conscious of the gap between what she weighed and moved like and what she was supposed to weigh and move like. In this cabin, Ronan observed her with the same level attention he gave everything: the fire, the weather, the trap, hardware. And none of it was judgment. It was just information, and what he did with information was practical rather than critical. On the 7th morning, the sky cleared. Not fully. There were still banks of cloud to the northwest, and the temperature had dropped sharply overnight. But the immediate storm had passed, and the mountains around them emerged from the gray in their actual white enormity, and the light off the snow was so bright it was almost violent after days of dim gray white. She was outside with the bucket when the sky cleared, getting snow to melt for water, and she stood up and looked at the range around her and felt something in her chest move. It was not beautiful in any comfortable way. Beautiful implied welcome, and the mountains were the opposite of welcoming. They were enormous and indifferent and covered in enough snow to kill you several times over, but they were real in a way she found herself needing. The scale of them made the entire question of what her stepmother thought about her body seem briefly, mercifully small. The mountains did not know about the taxonomy of useful people and burdens. The mountains did not run the numbers. She stood in the snow with her bucket and looked at the cascades for a long time. "Cold," Ronan said from behind her. She hadn't heard him come out. "Yes," she said. He came to stand beside her, not close but near, and he looked at the same mountains for a moment. "Does it ever stop feeling like it could just take everything?" she asked. He thought about this. "No," he said, "but you stop needing it to." She considered that. It was the kind of answer that would have annoyed her in a different context, opaque, like a riddle, but from him it felt like an honest accounting. He wasn't telling her the mountain became friendly. He was telling her the mountain stayed exactly what it was, and you learned to exist alongside it anyway. She picked up her bucket. "I'll make coffee," she said. He followed her inside. The door closed. The mountains stayed where they were, enormous and white and genuinely unconcerned, and inside the cabin the fire caught, and the coffee came to heat, and the rhythm of the day assembled itself from its parts, and Evelyn Hart moved through it with her imperfect hip and her imperfect history and the very slow, very quiet knowledge that she was not, at this particular moment, dead weight to anyone. She was just here. And here, for now, was enough. The second week settled into the cabin differently than the first. The first week had been about survival in its most immediate sense: warmth, food, basic function, the body's urgent work of recovering from what the mountain had done to it. The second week was something harder to name. The emergency had passed, and what remained was just the fact of two people in a small space in a closed-in winter, with the storm cycling between heavy and moderate and never fully absent, and all the ordinary friction that comes from proximity without the urgency to smooth it over. She found his habits. He found hers. He woke before light every morning and had the fire built up and water heating before she was fully conscious. He was not quiet about this, the wood going in, the iron hooks scraping, but he wasn't trying to be quiet either. It wasn't consideration for her sleep so much as indifference to it. The movements of a man who had lived alone so long, he no longer modulated himself for an audience. She stopped expecting him to and started just waking up to the sounds, lying in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the fire take hold before she got herself up and moving. He had a habit of standing at the oilskin window in the evenings, looking out at nothing that could actually be seen through it, one hand against the wall. She never asked what he was looking at or thinking. It seemed like the kind of thing you didn't ask. She had a habit of talking to herself under her breath while she cooked, and she didn't realize she was doing it until the third time he said, "What?" from across the room, and she had to explain she wasn't talking to him. He didn't find this odd, or if he did, he kept it to himself. They argued once about the salt pork. She had been stretching the stores carefully, rationing the salt pork into smaller portions so it lasted longer in the soups and stews, and he came in from the trap line, having been out since before dawn in bitter cold, and she put a bowl in front of him that had more bean than meat, and he ate half of it without saying anything, and then said flatly, "I need more than this." She looked at him. "The pork has to last. I've been on the line since 4 in the morning. I burned through everything I had by noon." "I know, but if I use it at the rate you—" "Evelyn." He set down his spoon. He wasn't angry, but he was direct in a way that didn't leave much room. "I'm not a small man. I've been in cold weather doing hard work for 8 hours. Rationing like we're at starvation level when we're not there yet is just, it's not the right call." She pressed her lips together. She had been rationing the way Margaret had trained the household to ration, conserve first, always, because waste was the enemy. And she recognized, even as she wanted to defend her position, that Ronan's point was functionally correct. A man running trap lines in a mountain winter needed caloric density. Hungry men made mistakes. Mistakes in this environment killed you. "Fine," she said. She got up and added more salt pork to his bowl from the pot. He ate it. When he was done, he said, "Thank you." "You were right," she said, which cost her something, but less than she'd expected. He looked at her. Doesn't happen often. She wasn't sure if he meant he was rarely right or that she rarely admitted it. She let it go either way. The wolves announced themselves on a Thursday, or what she calculated was a Thursday, having kept a rough count of days on a piece of bark she'd been marking with the folding knife. She heard them first at dusk, when Ronan was still out on the eastern trap line and she was alone in the cabin, a sound that started as something she thought was wind moving through the rock formations and resolved, when she stopped and listened hard, into something else entirely. Lower. More irregular. Multiple sources. She went to the window and peeled back the edge of the oilskin and looked out and saw nothing in the fading light except the tree line about 40 yards off, dark and dense. But she could feel the sound in her sternum now, the particular resonance of it, and she had grown up around enough working dogs to know what a howl meant, and what a hunting call meant, and what she was hearing was something in the second category. She put the oilskin back and checked the latch on the door, which she knew was solid but checked anyway. Ronan came in about 20 minutes later. He came in fast, the way he moved when something warranted it, and he latched the door behind him without her having to mention it. "You heard them," she said. "Saw 2 at the eastern break." He shook snow off his coat. His face was set in a way she'd learned to read as focused rather than afraid. "Pack, not a pair. Moved parallel to me for about a quarter mile before they cut south." "How many?" 7, maybe 8 that I counted. Could be more." He went to the wall where the rifle hung and took it down and checked it. "They're starving. The deep snows made hunting impossible for them." She watched him. "Have they come to the cabin before?" "Not like this." He said it without drama. "Usually they work lower elevation. The snows pushed everything down and crowded the ranges. They're looking for anything now." She thought about the horses that some of the trappers and mountain men kept. "You don't have animals here." "No. I travel on foot in winter." He went to the shelf and got the cartridges, counted them, replaced them. They won't break through the walls. The door and window are the concerns. The door's solid. He glanced at the window. I need to put another board across the window frame. She was already up. Where? He pointed her to the piece of lumber he wanted. She held it while he hammered it into place across the window frame. The two of them working in the small space with the hammering echoing and outside, at intervals, the wolves cycling through their calls. Not constant, not theatrical, just intermittent in the way of animals that were patient and had nowhere else to be. When the board was in place, they stood in the reinforced cabin and listened. Can I shoot? She asked. He looked at her. The rifle. Can I manage it? Have you before? My father had a rifle. I was a better shot than Caleb, which my stepmother found inappropriate. She said this without particular bitterness. It was just a fact. I haven't fired in about a year, but I haven't forgotten. He handed her the rifle. She checked it the way she'd been shown, confirmed the load, set the hammer to half cock, kept the muzzle pointed at the floor. He watched her do all of this, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, but something adjacent. If they come at the door, he said, you aim for the chest, not the head. Bigger target. You've got one shot and you want it to count. I know, she said. He took the rifle back. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. It didn't that night. The wolves circled until well after dark and then moved off, south toward the lower terrain, and the howling went distant and finally disappeared into the mountain silence. She and Ronan sat up until the sounds were gone, one on each side of the fire, not talking much, and when they were both satisfied the wolves had moved on, they went to their respective sleeping arrangements without ceremony. But she lay awake for a long time, and she suspected he did too. The wolves came back 2 nights later, and this time they were bolder. She was asleep when it started. A sound against the door, not quite a scratch, more like a body pressing against it, testing. And she was on her feet before she was fully conscious, which told her she'd been listening for it even in sleep. The fire was low. Ronan already up, across the room with the rifle. Stay back, he said. Low, not harsh. She ignored this because staying back was not a useful instruction when she was the one closer to the shelf with the hatchet on it. She picked up the hatchet. She was not going to throw a hatchet at a wolf through a door, but the weight of it in her hand was information about what she was prepared to do, and that felt important. The pressure on the door went on for about 30 seconds. Then a sound, a high, abbreviated yelp, and then silence. Ronan said nothing. What was that? She asked. One of them hit the door frame wrong, or got spooked by something. Hard to say. He waited another minute, still watching the door. They've gone. She lowered the hatchet. They looked at each other across the dim room, and she was aware, in a way that was purely factual and not uncomfortable, that they were a unit in this moment, in a way that had not been a choice and had not been arranged, just had been established by the slow work of the weeks, by the soup and the harness stitching, and the argument about salt pork, and the shared silence at the window. They were 2 people in a cabin managing a winter together, and neither of them was managing it alone. She put the hatchet back on the shelf. Go back to sleep, he said. You first, she said. He almost smiled at that. She saw the edge of it before he turned back to the fire. She had been there 22 days when the trapline accident happened. She knew the number precisely because she had continued her bark calendar, 1 mark per day. The small ritual of it grounding in a way she didn't examine too closely. 22 days. 3 weeks and 1 day since her family had driven east without her. She had stopped doing the daily accounting of that fact the way she'd been doing it at first, going over it like worrying a loose tooth. It was still there, it still had weight, but she'd started putting it on a shelf the way Ronan put things on shelves, filed rather than displayed. The morning of day 22 was clear and sharp, temperatures low enough that her breath was visible the moment she opened the door, and Ronan had left for the trap line before she was up, which was not unusual. He ran the eastern line in the mornings and the shorter western circuit in the afternoons when the afternoon light was still workable. She had bread rising on the shelf. She'd found enough flour and had developed a technique for the elevation and the wood-fired heat that produced something approximately bread-like, and a pot of beans going low and slow, and she had resettled into the domestic morning rhythm that she'd stopped feeling strange about a week ago. The afternoon came and went, and Ronan didn't. She noticed the absence at the usual time but held off concern. The trap lines were not clockwork. They went long sometimes. He'd been late before. She kept the beans on low heat. She watched the light shift on the mountain through the gap in the boards over the window. When the light was gone and he still hadn't come, she built the fire up. An hour into full dark, she heard him. Not the usual entry, the quick, purposeful steps and efficient movements of a man who had covered ground efficiently. What she heard was wrong, a dragging, irregular sound from outside, something between footsteps and not. And then the door opened and he came through it, and she saw immediately. His left leg, the way he was holding it, not bending the knee right, the whole limb moving as a unit in the way a limb moves when something in it has stopped working the way it should. His face was a particular shade of gray-white, not cold pale, but the pale of someone who had been fighting pain for an extended time and was losing ground to it. He had something tied around his thigh above the knee, a strip of leather from his coat, she realized, tourniquet or compression, done one-handed in the field. "What happened?" she said, crossing the room. "Deadfall." He was already moving toward the chair by the fire, one hand on the wall. "A log broke loose on the western slope, came down on my leg." He sat in the chair with a controlled descent that still made the color drain further from his face. "I don't think it's broken. I think it's the muscle, and maybe there's a cut." She got his coat off. She got down in front of him and looked at the leg. He'd lost the lower part of a trouser leg somewhere, cut it away probably, and she could see the leather binding above the knee and below it. The calf was wrong, the shape of it off. A swelling that was building even as she looked at it, and a cut along the outside of the calf that was deeper than she wanted it to be and had soaked through the leather wrapping he'd improvised. "How far did you walk?" she asked. She was keeping her voice even with some effort. 3 miles about." He said it flatly, like a report. "Took me 2.5 hours. 3 miles on a leg like that, in mountain snow, in the dark, alone." She filed this away in the category of things that told her what kind of man he was without him having to say anything about it. "I need to look at the cut," she said. "It needs cleaning. Do you have spirits?" "Flask in my coat, right inside pocket." She got the flask. She got the cloth she'd been using for straining the bean liquid because it was the cleanest thing she could find in the moment. She got the knife from her pocket, which she'd cleaned obsessively since arriving as a matter of habit. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know." She unwrapped the leather tourniquet. The cut was 4 inches long, deeper at the center, the kind of wound that needed to stay clean more than it needed to stay closed. She'd seen enough farm injuries to know the difference between a wound that demanded stitching immediately and one where infection was the primary concern, and this was the second type. She poured a careful measure of the spirits over it, watching for the quality of his reaction. He made a sound through his teeth, controlled, and his hands on the arms of the chair went rigid. And then she pressed the cloth to it and held it. "Pressure for a while," she said. "Then I want to see it in the firelight." "All right," he said. His voice was tighter than usual. He was managing it. She held the cloth against the wound and looked at his face. He was staring at the fire, jaw set, doing the same thing she'd done in the rock hollow, working through it systematically, using what he had. "The muscle or the bone?" she asked. "When you're honest about it." "Muscle," he said. "I bent the knee coming home. If it was bone, I couldn't have bent it." A pause. "It's bad. Not broken bad, but bad. You're going to be off the trap line." "Yeah." "For how long?" He was quiet for a moment. 2 weeks if I'm lucky. Maybe more." She nodded. She kept the pressure on the wound. "The traps," he said. "I'll run them," she said. He looked at her then, away from the fire, and she met his eyes directly. "You don't know the lines," he said. "Then you'll tell me." She said it simply, without bravado. It was just the math of the situation. If the traps weren't run, the animals froze in them, and the traps were wasted, and the food and trade resource they represented was wasted. The trap lines needed running. She was the mobile person. "Draw me a map, tonight if you can stand it. Show me the markers you use." He looked at her for a long moment, that assessing look, but different from the first one in the snow hollow. That had been someone calculating the probability of her survival. This was something else, someone recalculating a set of assumptions. "It's hard terrain," he said. My hip has been working for 3 weeks now. And the terrain I walked through in the storm was harder than your trap lines. She said this not defensively, but as plain information. I can do this. He held her gaze for another few seconds. All right, he said. She turned back to the wound. The cloth was doing its work, the bleeding slowing. Good. Now let me look at this in the better light, and then you're going to drink the rest of that flask and sleep. I don't need Ronan. She said his name in a tone she hadn't used with him before, and it surprised them both. Firm. Not unkind, but not asking. You walked 3 miles on a bad leg in the dark. The adrenaline is wearing off and the pain is going to be worse in about an hour, and you need sleep more than you need to argue with me about the flask. A silence. You sound like someone's mother, he said. Is that a complaint? The edge of the not quite smile again. No, he said. It's not. She cleaned the wound as carefully as she could in the firelight, closing the edges of the cut with strips of cloth bound tight. Not stitched, she didn't have thread fine enough and needle curved right, and her hands were not sure enough for that work, but bound tight enough to hold if he stayed off it. The swelling in the muscles she wrapped in cold, wet cloth and repacked every hour through the night, keeping the temperature down. He slept in the chair because getting to the bed required the kind of movement his leg wouldn't tolerate, and she stayed by the fire, keeping the cloths cold and watching the quality of his breathing and checking for the fever that she knew was the real threat now. Not the wound itself. The wound was manageable. Infection was not. In a mountain cabin with no physician within 3 days' ride and winter locked in the pass, a serious infection was the kind of problem that only went in one direction. She watched him through the night, the way she had watched the farm animals through their difficult nights when she was young, not with the helpless feeling she'd expected to have, but with the concentrated attention of someone who has a task to perform and is going to perform it. She heated water, she changed the cloths, she checked his skin for heat that went beyond normal. Sometime around 3 in the morning, she sat back in her chair by the fire and looked at him sleeping in his chair across from her and thought about something Margaret had said to her once, early in Evelyn's time with the injury, when the healing had been slow and the dependency obvious. You can't expect the world to carry you, Evelyn. You're not built for being carried. She had believed that for a long time. She had believed it all the way into a snowstorm. And now here she was, in a cabin in the Cascades, keeping a man alive through the night with cold cloths and attention, and the information in her hands, and no one had asked her to do it, and her hip was a consistent background ache, and she was tired, and she was doing it anyway. Not because she was trying to prove something, because it needed doing, and she was the one here. She thought, Margaret was wrong about what built means. The fire burned. Ronan's breathing stayed even. Outside, somewhere on the mountain, the wolves were somewhere in the dark, doing what they did. And Evelyn Hart kept the cloths cold and fed the fire and stayed awake through the long middle of the night, not gracefully, not without cost, but steady. She was beginning to understand that steady was its own kind of strength, not the loud kind, not the kind that got named, just the kind that was still there at 4 in the morning when everything else had gone out. The fever came on the second day. She had been watching for it, checking his skin every few hours with the back of her hand the way her mother had done, forehead, throat, the inside of the wrist where the temperature read truest. And the first morning after the accident, he had been hot but manageable, the kind of heat that said the body was fighting rather than losing. She'd kept the wound clean, kept him drinking water, kept the fire at a steady temperature rather than the aggressive heat that felt like doing something but actually dried the air and made everything worse. The second morning, the heat in him was different. She felt it before she was fully awake. She had been sleeping in the chair again, light and alert the way she'd been sleeping since the accident, and she came to consciousness and looked across at him, and his face was wrong even in the low firelight. The color, the slight shine of sweat on his forehead, the way his breathing had changed from the deep, slow pull of real sleep to something shallower and faster. She was up and across the room before the thought completed itself. Ronan. She put her hand to his throat. The heat came off him in a wave. He opened his eyes. They were not right, glassy in the way of fever eyes, tracking a half-second slow. I'm fine, he said, which was such an obviously untrue statement that she didn't bother responding to it. You're running a fever. She went to the water basin. The water was cold. She'd packed snow into it the night before. And she soaked the cloth she'd been using for his wound. You need to drink. A lot. Do you have any willow bark? A pause. Third shelf, tin with a green cloth tied on it. She found it. Dried bark, stripped and cut into pieces the right size for steeping. She put water on to boil and went back to him with the cold cloth and pressed it to his forehead and throat, and he submitted to this without argument, which told her more about how bad he felt than the fever had. "The wound," she said. "I need to look at it." "It's not the wound." His voice was hoarse. "I think it's the cold exposure. I was wet for most of the walk back. If the wound were infected, you'd see it in the leg." She looked at the leg anyway. He was right. The wound itself was holding, the edges pink but not angry, no smell that would signal what she feared. She redid the binding. She went back to the water, which was heating, and put the willow bark in and let it steep. "You've done this before," he said, from the chair. Watching her. "Nursed someone through fever?" She kept her back to him, watching the water. "My father was sick the winter I was 17. My stepmother managed the household. I managed my father." She paused. "He recovered." "And you?" She turned around. He was looking at her with the fever-bright eyes that still, even imprecise, held that quality of direct attention. "I'm fine," she said, using his own words back at him. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. She brought him the willow bark tea when it was ready, and he drank it without protest, and she settled back into the chair across from him, and they sat in the familiar silence of the cabin, while outside the temperature was dropping and the mountain was doing what the mountain did, indifferent and enormous. And inside she watched him for signs that the fever was climbing rather than sitting. It sat for most of the day. Not climbing, not breaking, just holding at a level that was serious but not yet critical. That uncomfortable plateau where the body and whatever it was fighting had reached a temporary standoff. She ran the closer trap line in the afternoon, the short western circuit he'd sketched for her on a piece of bark the evening after the accident, working from his landmarks. The split pine, the rock formation shaped like a boot heel, the creek bend with the ice that formed in a particular shelf pattern. She had been running both lines for 3 days now, and she had made enough mistakes that she no longer felt humiliated by them. The first day she'd missed 2 traps entirely, walked right past the markers. The second day she'd gotten tangled in her own snowshoes on a descent and come home with a bruised knee and her pride in worse shape than her body. Today she found everything she was looking for, cleared the 4 traps that had caught, reset them the way he'd shown her, and made the circuit in a time she thought he'd consider acceptable. She came home to the cabin and stamped the snow off her boots and brought in 2 rabbits and a marten and found him with more color in his face than she'd left him with, which she registered with a relief she didn't display. "Better?" she said. "Some." He looked at what she was carrying. "You found the upper markers." "Eventually." She hung the catch and started on the rabbits. "I overshot the split pine again, about 20 yards. I need a secondary marker between that and the boot heel rock." He described one, a cluster of birch saplings she'd been walking past without registering as deliberate. She filed it. She cleaned the rabbits with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times and was past finding it interesting, and she put them on to braise with the dried onion and a bit of the preserved berry for acid, and the cabin filled with the smell of cooking, and she could feel him, across the room, slowly rejoining the present tense. "Evelyn," he said. She looked over. "Thank you." He said it straight, no qualifier, no deflection. She turned back to the pot. "You'd have done the same." "I don't know that," he said. "I've never had to." She thought about that while she worked. He'd been alone here for 7 years. He'd built a system calibrated for one person, where every load had one carrier, every task had one pair of hands. She had come into that system broken and useless, or so it had seemed, and now she was running his trap lines while he sat in a chair with a fever, and they were both still alive and the fire was burning and there was food cooking and the cabin was holding. "Ronan," she said, not turning around. "Yeah, when you decided to pull me out of that rock hollow, when you heard me and you came, did you think about—" She stopped, tried to find the right shape for the question. "Did you think about what it would cost, having someone here?" The silence stretched long enough that she turned around to see if he was still conscious. He was. He was looking at the fire, and his expression was the complicated one she saw sometimes, the one that wasn't quite closed but was working toward honesty from a distance. "Yes," he said. "I thought about it." And I came anyway." He looked at her. I've walked past things I couldn't help. Can't help everything out here, but you were calling out. That's different. She turned back to the pot. She didn't have a response for that, not one that felt proportionate. She stirred the braise and let it rest. The fever broke on the third night, and she was awake for it. She'd been asleep in the chair when the change in his breathing woke her. Not deterioration, but the opposite, a deepening, a settling, the body releasing something it had been gripping. She put her hand to his forehead and found it damp, then cool, then merely warm, and she sat with her hand against his skin until she was sure she wasn't imagining it. He slept through the break and into the morning, the real deep sleep of someone whose body has just won something, and she built the fire up quietly and made coffee and sat with it and watched the light come through the gaps around the oilskin and thought about what came next. The trap lines. The wolves, still circling intermittently. She'd heard them 2 nights ago, closer to the cabin than before. His leg, which would need another week at minimum before he could put serious weight on it. The stores, which she had been managing carefully and which were adequate but not generous. All of it added up to a situation that required both of them functional, and one of them was currently sleeping through breakfast with a healing leg and post-fever exhaustion, which meant the other one needed to carry the weight for a while longer. She could carry it. That was the thing she'd learned or relearned or learned for the first time properly. She could carry it. He woke mid-morning, and she gave him coffee and food, and he ate with the appetite of a man whose body had just finished a war and was beginning to assess the aftermath. Some color back, eyes clear. The glassy fever looked gone. "How long was I out?" he asked. "You slept about 14 hours. He took stock of himself, moved the leg experimentally, hissed through his teeth. "Still bad." "Yes, but better than 2 days ago." He looked at her across the table. "You look like you haven't slept." "I slept in the chair." "Evelyn, I'm fine. Eat your food." He ate his food. She watched him do it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not pride, something quieter than either. Something that was simply the recognition of having been present for something that mattered and having been enough for it. The wolves came the night after the fever broke, and they came with intention. It started the way it always started. The distant howling, the circling, the pressure testing. But this time there were more of them. Or they were hungrier, or both. And the testing didn't stop after the first pass. She heard them working around the perimeter of the cabin, the sound moving from the north side to the east. And then something heavy hit the door once, hard, deliberate, and she was on her feet with the rifle and Ronan was up from the chair. Too fast she could see the leg cost him. And she had the rifle up and the door between her and whatever was outside. "Easy," he said. Not to her, to himself, she thought. He couldn't move fast. The leg would hold him standing but not running, not with any speed or agility, and he knew it and she knew it, and they both understood in that moment that the person managing any acute situation tonight was her. "Can I shoot through the door?" she asked. "No good angle. The wood will scatter the shot." He moved to the wall beside the door, one hand on it for balance. "If they get through, you shoot the first one that clears the frame. That close, you won't miss. The noise should push the others back." "Should." "Yeah, should." She positioned herself. 10 feet from the door, slightly right of center, rifle up, elbow under, the way she'd been taught. Her hands were steady. She noticed this about herself with the same flat clarity she'd been noticing things about herself since the storm. Steady hands, that was something. The pressure on the door built, wood creaking. The latch, which Ronan had built solid, was holding, but the frame around it was starting to give a complaint. Not breaking, but communicating. "When I say so," Ronan said, "open the door." She looked at him. "What?" "If we wait for them to come through, we're reacting. Open it on my count, I'll make noise, you fire over my head into the dark. The muzzle flash and the sound together. That's insane." "It's worked before." "When?" "Once," he said. "Worked once." She held the rifle. She ran the logic. A controlled moment versus an uncontrolled one. An open door she chose versus a broken door she didn't. At 10 feet she could fire over his head. She'd need to. "Count," she said. 3, 2, 1. She unlatched the door and shoved it open, and Ronan shouted from the wall. A full-throated, uninhibited shout. the kind of sound a man makes when volume is the only tool available, and she fired into the dark above the tree line, the rifle kicking back into her shoulder, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the snow in front of the cabin and the shapes at the tree line and the eyes of animals catching the light and then going as they wheeled and scattered. She got the door closed. She got the latch dropped. Silence outside for a long moment, and then the sound of movement going away, east, fast, and then the mountain silence reasserting itself, patient and enormous. She lowered the rifle. Her shoulder would ache tomorrow from the recoil. Right now, she couldn't feel it. "That worked," she said. "Yeah." He was breathing hard from the shout, or from the leg, or both. He leaned against the wall. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Once," she said. "Once before," he said. "Twice now." She went and reloaded the rifle. Her hands were still steady, and she was aware of them being steady, and she decided to let herself notice that without immediately finding a reason to diminish it. She had fired a rifle in the dark at a wolf pack while a man with a bad leg stood 3 feet to her left, and the door was open, and everything was at stake, and her hands had been steady. She put the rifle back on its hook. She sat down by the fire. After a while, Ronan limped over and sat in the other chair, and they sat in the way they had come to sit together, close enough for the fire's shared warmth, and far enough for each person's particular need for space, and the cabin settled into its nighttime sounds, and they let it. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know. You still didn't hesitate." She thought about how to respond to that, and what she landed on was honest. "I've been hesitating my whole life. I was trained to hesitate. Wait to be told whether I was worth listening to. Wait to see if I'd be corrected." She looked at the fire. "I think I ran out of hesitation somewhere in that snowstorm." He was quiet for a while. "Your stepmother," he said. "It wasn't really a question. And my father, who let it happen." She said it plainly, not with heat, not with the raw, torn-open quality it would have had a month ago. Something that had been a wound was becoming a scar, not healed exactly, but covered, changing texture. "He loved me. He just loved keeping the peace more. And the peace cost me." Ronan didn't offer her consolation. She had come to value this about him. He didn't reach for the easy comfort that was really about making the listener feel better rather than acknowledging what the speaker had actually said. He just held the silence with her, and that was a different thing entirely. "My brother," he said after a while. She looked over. The letters. "I told you I never opened them." He was looking at the fire. "He wrote me 6 letters over 2 years. There was a disagreement. When I left Montana, about why I was leaving and what I was running from, and he said things that were true, and I said things that were unkind, and I came out here, and he wrote me letters, and I kept them." A pause. "I kept thinking I'd open them when I was ready to hear what he had to say, and then he drowned." She didn't move. "The letters are still there," he said. "I know I should read them. I know they're probably not what I'm afraid they are, but there's a part of me that—" He stopped. "That if you don't open them, they stay possible," she said quietly. "They could say anything. They could say he forgave you, or understood, or just asked how you were. As long as you don't open them, they're all of those things at once." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's it." She looked back at the fire. "I understand that. I have things I'm not ready to open yet either. Your father. What I'm going to feel about my father when I'm not still in the middle of surviving what he let happen to me." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Right now, I'm still close enough to it that feeling it clearly seems dangerous, like it'll take the legs out from under me." "Maybe it will," Ronan said. "And then you'll get back up." She looked at him. He looked back, and his face in the firelight was the hard, angular face she'd first seen crouched in the entrance to the rock hollow, but she knew it well enough now to see what was underneath the surface of it, the capacity for it, the loss it had shaped him around, the particular loneliness of a man who had gone into wilderness to be alone and had perhaps been alone longer than was good for him. "You should read them," she said. "The letters." He was quiet. "Not because it'll be easy," she said, "but because he wrote them, and they're already true, whatever they say. You not reading them doesn't change what's in them." She paused. "And carrying something sealed is heavier than carrying something open. I know that now. He didn't respond immediately. He sat with it the way he sat with everything. Not deflecting, not rushing toward resolution, just holding it in front of him and looking at it honestly. Maybe, he said, finally. It was not a yes, but it was not a no. And from Ronan, maybe was the beginning of something. She let it rest there, where it was. She was learning that too, when to speak and when to let the thing she'd said find its own level, settle into whatever space it was going to settle into, without pushing. The fire burned down toward coals. Outside, the mountain was cold and enormous and doing what it always did. Somewhere out there, the wolves were working the lower slopes, following the hunger that drove them, doing what they needed to do to survive. She and Ronan sat by the fire in the imperfect, smoke-scented warmth of the cabin, two damaged and functional people, and she thought about the bark calendar on the shelf. 25 marks now, nearly a month. And she thought about spring, which was a long way off. And she thought about the question that had been building slowly at the edges of her thinking for the last week, the question she had not let herself examine directly yet. What was she going to do when the pass opened? She did not answer it tonight. She picked up the water basin and refilled it from the snow bucket and set it near the fire to stay liquid. She checked the door latch. She added one piece of wood to the coals, the size and placement that would keep the heat through the night without burning through too fast. All the small, necessary things. She went to the rope bed and lay down and pulled the blankets up and looked at the ceiling in the dark. And across the room she heard Ronan settle into something approaching sleep, and the cabin breathed its smoke and pine breath around them both. And the mountain outside was exactly what it always was. But the cabin held, and so did she. Spring in the Cascades did not arrive so much as negotiate. It came in increments. A day of warmer air followed by 3 days of hard freeze, a week of melt followed by a fresh snowfall that put everything back under white, as if winter were simply refusing to acknowledge the arrangement. The mountain did not hand spring over willingly. It released it in small, reluctant pieces, the way someone lets go of something they've been holding on to long enough that their hand has shaped itself around it. Evelyn watched it happen from the cabin door, every morning, doing the same accounting she'd been doing since November. The snow level dropping on the lower slopes, the creek below the cabin running audible for the first time in months, the ice thinning enough that she could hear water moving beneath it. The light different, not warmer yet, but longer, reaching further into the evening before giving up. The trees shaking off their snow loads and showing themselves again, dark and dense and present. Ronan's leg had healed over the course of 6 weeks, not cleanly, not completely, but functionally. He walked with a hitch in his left stride, now that she suspected would be permanent, a slight alteration in his gait that he managed without complaint, and that did not slow him on the trap lines, which he had taken back from her gradually, one circuit at a time, starting with the shorter western loop and working back to the longer eastern line as his endurance rebuilt. The wound itself had closed well. The muscle damage was the permanent part, a deep bruise in the tissue that had turned to scar and would always be stiffer than the right leg in cold weather. She knew something about that. They had never explicitly discussed the division of the trapline labor during his recovery. It had simply happened, and then it had unhappened in the same organic way when he was ready, and she had stepped back from the circuits without resentment and without the particular grief she might have expected, having learned something from them that she hadn't expected to learn. She could navigate this terrain. She could read the markers, reset the traps, carry the catch, make the distances. She had done it daily for 3 weeks in mountain winter on an imperfect hip, and her body had adapted to it the way bodies adapt to demands. Not without complaint, not without cost, but genuinely. She was stronger than she had been in November, not in the clean, linear way that stories tend to describe transformation, not a before and after with a clear line between them, just incrementally, quietly more capable than she'd been. Her hands were harder, her legs were more reliable on uneven ground. Her hip, while always present as a fact, had stopped being the thing she organized her movements around, and had become simply one of the conditions of her body, manageable, accounted for. Margaret would have found some reason to diminish this. Evelyn knew that, and the knowing no longer had the power it used to have. Ronan read the letters in March. She was outside when he did it, running the near trap line, and when she came back, the tin was on the table with the lid off, and the letters, 6 of them, she could see, were spread in front of him in a rough order. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands, not weeping, just still in the way of someone who has been hit by something real and is waiting to see what remains standing afterward. She set down the catch and went to the water and started the kettle without saying anything. She made coffee. She brought him a cup and set it beside the letters without looking at them and sat down across from him. He stayed with his face in his hands for another minute. Then he looked up. His eyes were dry, but the redness around them told her what the last hour had been. He wasn't angry, Ronan said. In the letters, he was... The first two were angry, or a little, but then they weren't. He looked down at the papers. He was just trying to understand why I left, and then he was just talking, telling me about the ranch, about a woman he was seeing, asking if I'd found what I was looking for out here. He was quiet for a moment. The last one says he hopes I'm warm. She held her coffee cup and didn't say anything, because nothing needed to be added to that. He wrote that 8 months before he drowned, Ronan said. I could have written back. I had time. I wasn't ready to start the conversation. I kept thinking there was more time than there was. Yes, she said. He looked at her. I know that feeling, she said. Not exactly, but the part where you assume the time is there because it always has been, and then it isn't. He folded the letters carefully. He put them back in the tin. He left the lid off this time, left it sitting open on the shelf rather than sealed away. And she understood this as a small but significant thing. Not resolved, just no longer sealed. Thank you, he said, for what you said, about opening them. She shook her head. You were ready. I just said it out loud. Sometimes that's what it takes. She drank her coffee and thought about her own father, the man who had loved her genuinely and protected her insufficiently, who had looked at the cleared wagon tracks in the snow and done nothing, or perhaps not looked at all, which was its own kind of answer. She had been building toward him in her thinking all winter, approaching that particular door the way she'd watched Ronan approach the tin, circling it, getting closer, not ready. She was getting closer to ready. The wagon train came through in the second week of April. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of animals and wheels and voices carrying up the slope from the pass road below, which had been clear and passable for about 2 weeks now. She and Ronan were working on the woodpile when the sounds reached them, and they both stopped and looked at each other and then toward the sound. It was a party of 7 wagons moving east, the first traffic through the pass since November. She watched them from the slope above the road, far enough that they hadn't noticed her yet, close enough that she could see the shape of it. The people moving with the particular weighted, focused movement of travelers who had been on the road for a long time and had further to go. Ronan stood beside her, leaning on the maul he'd been using. You should go down, he said. It was not a suggestion, and it was not a command. It was the flat, honest accounting of a practical man. She looked at the wagons. She thought about what they represented. East, civilization, towns with doctors and general stores and people who didn't live alone in mountain cabins. A world where a 22-year-old woman without family, without resources, without connections, would have to start building something from nothing, because that was the honest shape of her situation, stripped of sentiment. They might know where your family went, Ronan said, if they came through the same route. I know where my family went, she said. Montana. My stepmother's brother's land. She paused. I've known where they went since day one. He looked at her. She turned and went back up to the cabin. He came in an hour later. She was making soup, actually making it from the remaining winter stores and the first of the dried goods she'd been rationing toward spring, and she heard him come in and do his coat and boots routine and then come to the table and sit. They stopped, he said, at the lower clearing. They'll camp tonight and push east tomorrow. She stirred the pot. One of them came up the slope, he said, saw the cabin smoke, asked if I had supplies to trade. A pause. I told him I had a woman here who'd been stranded in November. He said there was a family named Hart that came through in February, made it to the Eastern Way Station in Montana. She stopped stirring. They made it, he said. Not gently, not harshly, just the fact. She turned around. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel when she heard that confirmation. Grief or relief, or the reopening of something she'd been keeping closed all winter. What she actually felt was complicated and quiet, like weather moving through. Important, but not devastating. Good, she said. I'm glad they didn't freeze. He looked at her steadily. The man said the family was asking around the way station about a daughter. Described you. Her hands went still. They left a message, Ronan said. At the way station, in case anyone had news. She absorbed this. Her father then had looked back after all. Or had been made to look back, or had been unable to not look back. She would never know the precise sequence of what happened in that wagon on that road when they drove away from the timber stand, whether Margaret had overridden him or whether he had simply failed to speak, whether the regret had come immediately or in the cold, clear light of a later day. She would probably never know. But he had looked for her. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She put it on the shelf, next to the other things she was still opening. What did you tell him? She asked. That I'd found you in the storm, that you'd been at the cabin through the winter. Ronan looked at his hands on the table. I didn't tell him more than that. It wasn't mine to tell. She looked at him across the cabin. This man who had pulled her out of a rock hollow in a snowstorm and handed her a cup of broth and asked her if she could walk a mile, and whom she now knew well enough to read the weather in his face the way she read the weather on the mountain. He offered passage, Ronan said. East, if you want it. The word landed in the cabin and sat there. East Montana. Her father's message at the way station. The life that had been arranged for her. The one she'd been in transit toward when she was put off the wagon. The one that had continued without her, that might be willing to absorb her back, that represented everything recognizable and familiar and set. She looked around this cabin. The rough walls she knew now in detail. The knot in the third plank from the hearth, the way the north wall breathed cold air at the corner where the chinking had settled. The shelf with Ronan's brother's letters sitting open-lidded in their tin. The fireplace she'd learned to manage. The rope bed. The tools on the wall, half of which she could now use. The bark calendar on the shelf. 143 marks. She had been here 143 days. He also said, Ronan continued, his voice careful, that the wagon company was heading into Oregon territory in summer. They'd be back through the pass. If you wanted passage west instead. He paused. Or if you wanted to send a letter east, he'd carry it. She went to the shelf, she got a piece of bark and the charcoal she used for marking, and she wrote, slowly, because she'd had limited practice and the surface was difficult, a short message. Her name. That she was alive. That she was well. That she had been found and was safe. That she knew where her father's message was, and that she would write more when she could. She did not write about Margaret. She did not write about the timber stand. She did not write, I know what you did, or I understand, or I forgive you, because none of those things were settled in her yet, and she was done saying things she didn't fully mean. She wrote, I am alive, I am not lost, I will find my own way to you when I'm ready. She folded the bark in cloth and tied it, and went out and found the man from the wagon company, and gave it to him, and told him the way station name, and he took it and said he'd see it delivered, and she thanked him and came back up the slope. Ronan was standing at the cabin door. She walked past him and inside. He followed. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, and she was aware of a particular internal stillness. Not emptiness, not numbness, but the feeling of a thing settling into its final shape, the way cooling metal settles. She had made a decision without announcing it, and she was checking it the way she checked everything now, practically, honestly, without the need for it to be more than it was. I'm not going, she said. Ronan didn't respond immediately. Not yet, she said, and then amended that. Maybe not at all. I don't know yet. She turned around to face him. I know that's not a clean answer. I wasn't asking for one, he said. I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I want to be clear about that. She held his gaze. I have somewhere to go. I could go east and find my father and build something there, or I could go west and build something from nothing, and I could do either of those things. I know that now about myself. She paused. I'm staying because I want to. Because what's here is worth staying for. He stood very still. You don't owe me anything, she said. I know what I came here as. Someone you carried out of a snowstorm. If you want me to take the passage east, I will, and I won't fault you for asking. The silence stretched out, and in the silence the fire made its sounds, and the creek below the cabin ran its new spring water over the thinning ice, and the mountain sat in its enormous, indifferent April and waited. I've been alone as this cabin for 7 years, Ronan said. He said it looking at her directly, not at the fire or the wall, which he knew was how he spoke when he was making himself be honest about something that cost him. I built it that way. I needed it that way. After Montana, after my brother, after all of it. I needed to be somewhere where the only thing I had to manage was the mountain. She didn't interrupt. And then you were in the rock hollow, he said, and I brought you here. And I thought, he stopped, tried again. I thought it would be a few days, until the storm cleared. And then it was a week, and then it was the leg, and then it was... He made a gesture that encompassed, she thought, the entire winter. And at some point, I stopped thinking about when you'd leave and started thinking about how the cabin worked better with you in it. She waited. That's not a poetic thing to say, he said. I know that. I don't need it to be poetic, she said. The cabin works better, he said again, and this time it was not about the cabin, and they both knew it. I work better. I know what I was before you got here. I was functional. I was surviving. I was not... He pressed his lips together. I was not this. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close, and looked up at his hard-angled face in the spring light coming through the oilskin window, and she thought about the first time she'd seen it, crouched at the entrance to the hollow, giving her no pity and no promises. Just the question of whether she could walk a mile. She put her hand against his jaw. He covered it with his. They stood like that for a long moment, not kissing, not moving, just standing in the particular intimacy of two people who have managed a winter together and know each other's weight and have held each other's worst hours and are choosing, with full information, to be here. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I reorganize shelves, and I talk to myself, and my hip makes me slow in the mornings. I know, he said. I've watched you for 5 months. And I'd rather have you slow in the mornings than not here at all. She lowered her hand. She stepped back, because the moment needed air, and she was not a woman who let important things get swept away in the current of feeling without being examined first. She had made that mistake all her life, of letting other people's certainty about her substitute for her own. She was not doing that again, even when the certainty was offered gently. I want to write to my father, she said, properly, when I'm ready. And I need to settle what I feel about him, which I haven't done yet. That's fair. And I want to be clear that I'm not staying to be useful. I'm not trading one arrangement for another. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being grateful you pulled me out of the snow. He looked at her steadily. I know that. I'm staying because I choose to, she said. And that choice belongs to me. Yes, he said. It does. She held his gaze for another moment and found nothing in it that contradicted what she needed to find. No possession, no calculation, no fine print taxonomy of what she cost versus what she contributed. Just a man who had watched her run his trap lines on a bad hip in a mountain winter and considered her, on the available evidence, someone worth standing beside. She turned back to the soup. It needs more salt, she said. She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close, the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding at tension. Then add it, he said, and came to sit at the table. They expanded the cabin that spring, not dramatically. This was not a construction project born of optimism, so much as necessity. The single room had functioned for one person and had been pressed to its limits by 2, and if 2 people were going to winter here again, they needed a proper storage room off the east side and a covered workspace where she could do the leatherwork and mending without it taking over the main table. He knew how to build, and she knew how to work beside someone who knew what he was doing, and the expansion went up over 6 weeks of April and May, rough and functional and exactly what it needed to be. She wrote to her father in May when the right words finally came. It was a long letter, written over 3 evenings on proper paper she'd traded a tanned pelt for when a small supply rider came through the pass. She did not make it easy or smooth. She wrote honestly about what had happened in the pass, the timber stand, the tracks, the understanding that had come to her in the snow. She wrote about the rock hollow and Ronan. She wrote about the winter, not all of it, not in ways that weren't hers to share, but enough that he would understand what she had survived and how. She wrote, I know you looked for me and I'm glad you did, but I need you to understand what was asked of me on that road and whether you knew what was being asked. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure you do either. I am not asking you to condemn Margaret. I am asking you to tell me the truth of that morning when you're ready to tell it. I will be here. She wrote, I am not angry in the way I thought I would be. I am something quieter than angry. I am someone who survived what I wasn't supposed to survive, and I'm still deciding what that means. I will write again. She sealed it and sent it with the next rider east. She did not know if her father would answer honestly. She did not know if her father had the capacity for the conversation she was asking him toward. People did not always become, when pressed, what you needed them to be. That was one of the things the winter had taught her, that you could survive on what you had, without the support you should have had, and the absence of that support would always be real and would always be part of the story, but it would not be the whole story. Margaret had made her a calculation. Dead weight, costs more than she contributes, not built for being carried. She thought about that sometimes, in the evenings by the fire. She thought about the trap lines and the fever nights and the rifle in the dark with her hands steady. She thought about the bread she'd learned to make at elevation and the harness stitching and the soup that Ronan said occasionally was the best thing he'd eaten in 7 years, which she took as the significant compliment it was from a man who did not traffic in empty ones. She thought, Margaret was doing the math wrong, not because Evelyn had become extraordinary, not because the winter had turned her into someone else, some better, stronger, more capable version of herself that had been waiting inside the flawed original. That was not what had happened. What had happened was simpler and harder to articulate. She had found out what she was made of when there was nothing left to manage her impression of it. And what she was made of was not perfect. The hip would always be the hip. Her hands were not always steady. She still talked to herself while she cooked and still reorganized shelves without asking. And there were mornings when the weight of what her family had done settled on her like weather, and she carried it through the day alongside everything else. But she carried it. That was the point. She had been told, in every language available to a stepmother who kept her cruelty in the register of practicality, that she was someone who needed to be carried. And it had turned out, when the test was actual rather than theoretical, that she was the one doing the carrying. That knowledge was hers now. Not fragile, not borrowed, not dependent on anyone else's assessment of it. Hers. On a morning in late May, the pass was fully open and the sky was the kind of blue that the mountains only produce after months of denying it. And Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the slope above the cabin and looked at the range around her. Below her, the cabin with its new East Edition, smoke rising from the chimney because Ronan had the fire going, which he always did before she was up, which was one of the things about him she had stored in the category of things she did not say much about but noticed and kept. The creek running clear and cold and fast with the melt. The tree line dense and dark and present. The trap line markers she could pick out now from this distance, the split pine, the boot heel rock, like letters in a language she'd learned to read. Her hip was stiff this morning. It was always stiffer in the morning, the joint slow to warm up, requiring the particular patient sequence of movement before it would operate freely. She had stood here and done the sequence, weight shift, rotation, the slow, deliberate walk in place that looked slightly odd and was entirely effective. And now she was standing on a slope in the Cascades in late May, with the mountains enormous around her and the world open in every direction. East was her father's message at a way station and a conversation she was still building toward. East was Caleb, who was 17 and had sat in the wagon with his rifle across his knees and said nothing. East was the life that had been planned for her before anyone asked her what she planned. West was the unknown, which was its own kind of invitation. And here was here, a cabin she'd helped expand, a man who understood silence and told her the truth, and had once carried her out of a snowstorm without making her feel carried. A winter she had not just survived but inhabited, had been fully present for, had contributed to, had shaped. She was 22 years old, and she had been discarded on a mountain road in November, and she was still here in May, and the road was open in both directions, and she was not going to take either of them today. Not because she was afraid of them, not because she had settled for this, but because you could only make the choice to stay from a position of having real choices. And she had real choices now. And she was choosing to be where she was. That was the thing about staying that people didn't talk about. Leaving was understood as agency. You packed up, you went, you made your way. Staying read as inertia, as lack of options, as being left behind. But staying could be a choice as deliberate and clear-eyed as any departure, if you made it with your eyes open and your hands free and your history fully accounted for. She was not left behind. She had stayed. Those were not the same thing. And the difference between them was not small. The difference between them was the difference between a woman defined by what was done to her and a woman defined by what she did with it. It was the difference between an ending and a beginning that looked, from the outside, like the same unchanged place. The mountain was still harsh. Her body was still imperfect. The world outside this range was still the world it had always been, full of people like Margaret, who ran their numbers, and people like her father, who loved inadequately, and roads that could carry you away from yourself if you weren't careful. None of that had changed. What had changed was her. Not into someone else. Into someone more fully herself than she had been allowed to be before. Less managed, less edited, less organized around the gap between what she weighed and what she was supposed to weigh, between the speed she moved at and the speed she was supposed to move at. The mountain had stripped all of that away, the way cold strips everything down to what's essential, and what was left underneath was someone she could work with, someone she was, in fact, starting to like. Below her, the cabin door opened and Ronan came out and looked up the slope at her, the way he did sometimes when she'd been out long enough to check on. He didn't call up or make a gesture. He just looked, the way he looked at everything, straight on, without apology, with the patient quality of someone who had learned to see things clearly rather than hopefully. She raised a hand. He raised one back. She turned and came down the slope toward the cabin, her hip finding its rhythm in the movement, steady, if not smooth, functional, if not graceful. The smoke from the chimney came toward her on the morning air. The creak noise was close and clean. The door was open. She went inside. The mountain stayed where it was, enormous and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with what any of it meant. But inside the cabin, coffee was on, and there was work to do, and Evelyn Hart was not someone left behind. She was someone who had looked at the open road and chosen the life in front of her. And that, in the end, was the only kind of staying that was worth anything at all.